Every 50th year, the Torah commanded Israelite society to effect a sacred reset, a year-long Shabbat of Shabbats, a national release of all plunged into debt slavery. Leviticus, Vayikra chapter 25, verse 10 teaches, "You must sanctify the 50th year, proclaim liberty throughout all the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a jubilee, a yovel for you. Each of you shall return to your holding, each of you shall return to your family. Kidashtem et shnat ha-chamishim shana, ukaratem dror l'chol ha'aretz l'chol yoshveha." Now I know what you're thinking. Wait a minute, this is part of Trua's video series about the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, which is approaching its 50th unhappy anniversary. And yes, the occupation is unjust. But is he really comparing it to slavery? Isn't that reckless? What is the connection of the 50th year release to the 50-year mark of the occupation? Vayikra chapter 25 is not, I don't think, ultimately about slavery. It's about the vision for a healthy society. It's about what we mean when we talk about freedom. So let's unpack it. Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. What is the vision in this verse, which is engraved into America's iconic symbol of freedom, the Liberty Bell? The Hebrew word translated by King James as liberty is a somewhat obscure and unusual word, dror. The Talmud on Rosh Hashanah 9b says that everyone agrees that dror means cherut, a more common word for freedom. But what then is the valence of this freedom? Why this word, dror? Rabbi Yehuda says that dror is related to the word dar, to dwell, like one who dwells in any dwelling and engages in commerce in any state. Kemidayer beidaira movil schora bechol medina. Liberty is about freedom of movement and of livelihood. This sense is animated by two biblical passages that use the word dror as the name of a certain kind of a bird, most likely a swallow, described with two attributes. In Psalm 84, finding a nest for herself to set her young, udror ken la asher shata efrocheha, and in Proverbs chapter 26, that this bird flies around, kitzipur lanud, kidror lauf. Why is the swallow called a dror? The Gemara on Shabbat 106b explains that it is because the bird accepts no authority, einam mekabelet marut. It lives, dara, in a house, just as it does in the field. Liberty as the kind of freedom of movement that cannot be controlled or subjugated at all, as the ability to protect one's children anywhere, free as a bird. But the Ramban in 13th century Spain says that truthfully, dror comes from the word dor, which means generation, as in the verse in Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, dor holech v'dor ba. A generation comes, a generation goes, but the land remains eternally constant. Liberty is security in the long game. Political and economic ups and downs from year to year, generation to generation, are a distraction. You know you're standing in your home. It awaits your dignified return. In another place, the Ramban notices a different valence. The word dror also appears in Exodus, Shemot, chapter 30, in the context of the recipe for the anointing oil in the Mishkan. The Torah required myrrh to spice up the oil. But what kind of myrrh? Dror myrrh, mar dror. The Midrash Sifra explains that this means pure or unadulterated myrrh, since that is a spice that can easily be tainted undetected. Dror, then, is about a release from the corrupting substances that dilute, overwhelm, or taint one's identity. Ramban says that it stands to reason that this is what dror always means: cleanliness, purity, nikiyut, and that in the Jubilee year, proclaim dror throughout the land to all its inhabitants means that all those in the land should be clean from slavery and from any enslavement or subjugation of their bodies or their land. Liberty, then, must also be emotional, psychological, and cultural. What must we do to scrub away all damaging after effects of subjugation? When the Torah talks about the Jubilee, then, it's not simply talking about releasing slaves. It's saying that the land of Israel is a place whose inhabitants, all of whose inhabitants, kol yoshveha, must return to a true state of dror, of total freedom of movement, livelihood, familial protection, freedom from emotional scarring, of being our full selves. And that this reset every 50 years will penetrate throughout the generations in the meantime to affirm that encroachments and taints on our dror are fleeting. I think it's fairly obvious that the Holy Land today is pretty far from a state of dror to all its inhabitants. Direct passage between Palestinian cities is often impossible. Where passage is available, it's obstructed by the indignity of long waits and uncertain outcomes at military checkpoints. Palestinian parents cannot protect their children from soldiers entering their homes in the dark of night, sowing fear and disarray. Permits are not granted to Palestinians to expand their homes. When they do so anyway, they're bulldozed. Farmland owned by Palestinians is regularly confiscated by the IDF and turned into closed military zones, often later turned over to the state for inclusion into or buffer around an expanded Israeli settlement. Water and utilities are routinely shut off. This occupation stains everyone involved, including Israelis. The Pnei Yeshua points out that the verse does not say, proclaim liberty throughout all the land for all of its slaves, l'chol avadeha, but for all its inhabitants, yoshveha. Why? For in a state where there is no freedom, even for a minority of its inhabitants, all its inhabitants are enslaved. We experience freedom only when there is no subjugation at all in a state. Subjugation is a plague that damages slave and master together. By freeing the subjugated people, all the inhabitants of a state become free. Havdut negahi shenogim ba ha'eved ve'adon gam yachad, al yidei shichur ha'avadim, kol toshvei ha'mdina yiyu b'nei chorim. After 50 years, we are commanded by God to proclaim dror unto the land for all its inhabitants. All of us together, our fates bound up in each other's. The Yovel is a utopia, but it's also a mitzvah, a utopia we are commanded to bring about. This year, after 50 years of occupation, exploitation, and subjugation, we must actively proclaim an end and insist on the full and profound liberty of all the Holy Land's inhabitants.